You can see it. Yes, okay, lovely. Oh, Kate, quick off the mark there. Brilliant. Okay, so if everybody can hear me okay, let's get started. First of all, thank you to the British Council and thank you, Paul, for this very kind invitation. And it is, I admit, a little humbling to see so many teachers from all over the world joining us today. And I hope you get something useful out of it. Okay, so what are we going to talk about? First of all, a little introduction to why we started this little project on WhatsApp, the background to it, looking particularly at the need for maximizing exposure to target language outside class, and particularly the use of mobile learning to do that. And then we're going to look at the WhatsApp studies and the WhatsApp project itself. And then we'll move on to the practical side of things and what we actually did on WhatsApp. And I think you can see that this is adaptable to many different contexts, or at least I hope they are. And based on the research that we've done on this, some of the results and recommendations based on these results. Okay. So out of class learning, I think as all of you are experienced teachers, you know that if we only limit our students to the English or the target language that they receive in class, this also limits their progress. So part of our job is encouraging them to get as much exposure outside class as possible. With increased exposure outside class becomes increased proficiency. This is a very famous study. It's quite old now, from Pia Sundqvist back at the beginning of the century. Where she was working in a Swedish context, and she surveyed literally thousands of EFL learners in Swedish high schools. And she found quite interesting results, actually, not only kind of logically that the more contact the students had with English outside class, the higher their level of proficiency. But she also found in this particular period, and bear in mind that we're talking 12 years ago, that boys had a higher level of English than girls. And this was mainly because they had more contact. And why was that? They were exposed to English through video games predominantly. It's not only boys playing video games, I know that, but at that particular time, in this particular context, they were playing more. And they were these interactive online video games. And on average, the average Swedish teenager in this study had something like 24 hours of contact with English outside school time. Now, I did my own little study, nothing as large as Pia Sundqvist's study, but back in 2015, I surveyed students in my own institution at B2 level, over 1,000 students. And in the Spanish context at the time, the average, including their homework, for adults or university students at this level was 4.5 hours a week. So it's a massive difference. I have to note at this point, though, that it's probably worth doing this again, because in the last couple of years, 2 or 3 years ago, we had Netflix, the arrival of Netflix into Spain. And I suspect if I repeated this study now, the amount of contact would increase enormously, because there's a whole Netflix generation coming up with increased exposure and the subsequent results on listening skills and vocabulary acquisition, etc. So at the time, in 2015, it was 4.5 hours a week. And bear in mind that these were committed adults who were enrolled on language courses. This wasn't just incidental. They were actively seeking out English, one would hope. Okay, so now I'm going to bring you in here. So that'll give me a chance to rest my voice for a minute or so. And I'd like to get your opinions, please. When you think of mobile language learning, what do you think of? Can you think of one word and write it into the chat about mobile language learning? It can be an adjective, it can be an idea. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. Remote, apps, accessible, shortcuts, fun. And WhatsApp again is coming up. Okay, supplementary, interaction, clear, Duolingo. Quick, easy, interactive, brilliant. All very, very positive so far. Nobody's got anything negative to say. That's great. Convenient, authentic, flexible, easy. Okay, there's a first negative that I've noticed. They're going very quickly now. Okay, so somebody said intrusive there. Gen Z friendly, that's a nice one. Okay, brilliant. Now I'm going to compare some of your ideas with a very informal survey that I've done for them from the literature. And the words that come up again and again in relation to mobile learning are potential. We've been talking about the potential of mobile learning for the last 20 years, so it's about time it was realized. Motivating, some of you mentioned that as well. Okay, lazy is there. Realistic, some of you use the word authentic. No, this is what our students are doing in English outside class. They're connecting via their mobile devices. And very convenient. Okay, so you use different words to describe this. No, convenient, easy, accessible were words that came up in the chat. Okay, incorrect English. Yes, there does tend to be a little bit of leeway with the type of English that you use. That's true. It's kind of abbreviated. And in the literature, people say, coincide with this. They say that it can help motivation. Emma Shioda is one of the leading researchers in the field of language learning motivation. And she says that mobile devices or mobile learning can help avoid motivational dissonance. Now, what this means is that sometimes there's a discrepancy, there's a difference between what we're doing in class and what the students are actually doing in English outside class. And one way of bridging the gap is by exploiting the potential of their mobile devices, which they're using anyway. Here we've got another one that says that teachers should catch up and teach with the devices or the tools that our students are really using. I'm not a big fan of anything that says teachers must or teachers should, because to be honest, we've got enough on our plates already. You notice that any kind of conference that you go to, that any talk on technology or new technology, the application of technology, is often packed, and that's because teachers feel this need to keep up with their students. They're scared of getting left behind. And I think really we should be worrying more about the pedagogical application. As Sophia said in the first of this series of talks earlier in the week on Teachers' Day on the 5th of October, that it's the pedagogy that's important rather than the app that you're using. And they're talking about the potential of mobile applications. Motivala, all the way back in 2007, which seems like ancient history now, talks about the push and the pull potential. What does this mean? The pull potential is the fact that our students have access to a whole world in the palm of their hand. So it pulls them in. They're interacting with the internet anyway. But the push potential is less research. There's not so much on this. And this is when we actually exploit it and we send them the things that we want them to do. Now, we have to be careful with this, of course, because that can lead to negative consequences. So it's not all rosy in the garden. It can be artificial. Okay, so what we're doing, if you've ever tried out, some of you mentioned some of the very popular language learning apps that you can use on mobile phones. And some of them have some often hilarious sentences for translation. It's not very natural at all. It can be intrusive. This might be an age factor. Again, some of you mentioned the Generation Z, or Generation Z if you're American. For older students, the constant ping, ping, ping of a WhatsApp group can be off-putting. Recently, there's been a few concerns about privacy issues. I'll come back to that later as well. And as I said before, it can be artificial. We also need to be careful that we're not just using a tool like WhatsApp or an equivalent platform just to send our students more homework, because then it just becomes an extension of the classroom. And they're not using the tool, the platform, in the way that it was meant to be used or the way that they use it for other things. And this creates this motivational dissonance that we were talking about before. So the pedagogy is important rather than the tool. Okay, now talking about privacy, I put this in here. I wanted to address the elephant in the room before we continue, because it often comes up in the Q&A at the end. Yes, I'm aware of the fact that WhatsApp is not for everybody. And if you're working with younger learners, it may not be an ideal platform of choice. For us, it was an obvious choice because it's a Spanish context. I was working with adults, and also because of my research group allowed me to use a special phone. So I wasn't sharing my phone details with my students. But having said that, I do belong to WhatsApp groups with my students on a regular basis, and I have done for the last 5 years. I'm also in WhatsApp groups with the parents at my children's school and in the residents association for the building where I live. In Spain, this is pretty normal, okay, but I'm aware of the fact that this might not be normal in other contexts. So you obviously have to take into account the local needs and concerns where you are. And there are alternatives. It doesn't have to be done on WhatsApp. This is just the most convenient one for us. And why is it convenient? Well, the statistics kind of speak for themselves, really. If you look at the numbers back, the figures back in 2017, when WhatsApp was taken over by Facebook, there were already 1 billion active users then. And where I live in Spain, Spain is the #1 or has the largest number of WhatsApp users in the whole of Europe. It's integrated within 99% of the population at the last count. And the concerns about privacy don't seem to have affected that use very much at all. So as I said, for us, it was the obvious choice, but obviously it depends where you are and what kind of restrictions you're working with. With children, you have to get the permission of the parents, etc., etc. So there has been research on using WhatsApp as a language learning tool before, and I've put these in chronological order rather than alphabetical order. This was a very groundbreaking study at the time, carried out here in Barcelona in the Open University, which was using WhatsApp as a resource for increasing learning, reading speed and fluency, basically by sending links to reading text to the students, which they could then read at their leisure, on the bus, on the train, coming to work, going to school, etc., on their phones. It's also been used to reduce EFL speaking anxiety using the voice recording function. This, I think, is a little bit more difficult. I'll come back to the speaking function a bit later on, but it has been used to do that with practice. It's been used to increase exposure to vocabulary. Again, we need to bear in mind, I don't know the details of this study, but we need to bear in mind that we don't want to use WhatsApp just to send them more homework, but to increase their exposure in as natural a way as possible. And more recently, it has been used to work on error correction and even assessment, again, here in Spain. And when I was preparing for this talk and I was chatting to Paul, he also told me about a British Council publication. I think it came out a couple of years ago. I don't know if I remember the names now. I think I've got them written down. Gary Mottram and Susan Dawson, who were using it with teacher training. And WhatsApp was a very useful tool in under-resourced contexts. They were working with trainee teachers in sub-Saharan Africa. So whereas participants might not have access to a fixed link to the internet through a computer or a laptop, they did manage to have access via their mobile phones. So that's another way of thinking about it as well. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the study that took place here before you get too worried about all these figures. Nothing to worry about, really. This is an ongoing study. We've done 4 different projects now. We started back in 2017, and the last study took place at the beginning of this year, the second term of the academic year, just from January to May 2021, approximately. And as you can see, there's some similarities and some differences between the groups. So they were all more or less B2 level. The second group, Group B, was a little bit lower, B1. And as you know, as working teachers, you can take an activity and it might work brilliantly with one group and it will be a complete flop with the next group. So it's important to try out these activities in as many different contexts as possible. The first group was my group, and it was a summer intensive course. So they were doing 5 hours of English every morning, 5 days a week. So this is a group that's highly motivated. They wouldn't have signed up for this course if they weren't. And they were also quite immersed in English, okay? And they were quite active in other things. And this was an exploratory study. So we were basically trying to find ways of maximizing their exposure to English outside class. So WhatsApp group was just one of the things that we had going on. We also had a Facebook group. We had a forum working on the Moodle page. We also had a class competition where they were winning points for their activity outside class. So the WhatsApp was just one element of this. Based on the results of this study, we saw that WhatsApp was clearly the most successful way of working with students in this particular context. So that's why we continued with it with other groups. The second group, Group B, had 4 hours of class on a Saturday morning, and they only met once a week. And then Group C and Group D, this was after COVID struck. Okay, so they went on to emergency remote teaching in the case of Group C, and Group D, I think, was already planned as a Zoom class anyway, so it was a synchronous online class. So they were generally 100-hour courses, apart from Group C, which was shorter. There was a good mix of men and women, slightly more women in these groups than, slightly more men, excuse me, in these groups than there would be normally. And on average, the age was about 25, 26. Okay. So what did we do with these groups? One of the lovely things about working with these different groups over different periods is that we could do an activity or a series of activities and then look at what worked and what didn't and tweak it and change a little thing for the next activity to see if that made any difference. So the first group, my original group, was a series of activities that were not related to the book. And it was completely voluntary. In fact, it was voluntary in all of these groups. They didn't have to participate if they didn't want to. It was outside class time. And we didn't even attempt to relate it to what they were doing in class. It was completely independent. And we mixed up open activities, open answers with drills, and it lasted about 8 weeks. Now, for the next group, we tried to integrate it a little bit more with what they were actually doing in class. So we wanted to see if this would support the learning of the course. But again, it was voluntary. And the second and the third and fourth group, in Group C and Group D, we were more interested in correction. Because I was on my own in the first group, I didn't really participate that much in the WhatsApp group. I set up the tasks and I kind of let them get on with it. But after that, we had an MA student coming in to moderate the WhatsApp group and to answer questions and to correct them. That's a whole other presentation. The advantages of having an MA student working with you, obviously, is a real luxury, but it does allow the teacher to step back a little bit from the WhatsApp group because it can become quite consuming. And finally, in the last group, the most recent group, we experimented with actually getting the students to write their own prompts. That's why there's so many tasks in the last group, because they weren't the kind of tasks where there was part 1 and part 2 had stages. It was just questions and answers. The students would write the questions and their classmates would answer. I'll give you some examples in a moment. And here is the original group back in summer 2017. And you'll see this picture quite a lot because it's the group picture at the top of the WhatsApp chat that we use. And when I show you some screenshot shots, you'll see them again. For this particular group, we used a lot of activities from this book. This was published in the same year in 2017 by Lindsay Clanfield and Jill Hadfield. And I think they just brought out a new book this year, which is related or something similar. I can't recommend this book enough, okay, because it's done all the hard work for you. It's really just a question of copying and pasting it into the chat or to the forum or whatever platform you're using. And they make some recommendations which are very similar when you hear them to setting up a speaking task in class. So if you're doing an activity or a task in WhatsApp, you should set it up like a classroom task. Demonstrate it first. The teacher models the type of language or interaction that they want the students to produce. Give clear instructions. Break the task up into stages. Set deadlines. Tell them clearly when you want it done by, and be present and positive. Scaffold the interaction, but then withdraw gradually and let them get on with it. So this will all sound very familiar. It sounds like a speaking task in class, and it does follow many of the same constructs, really. You set it up in the same way. Okay, so again, Lindsay and Jill, back to their book, they identify, I think it's 4 or 5 different interaction patterns. We had a limited amount of time, so we concentrated on only 2. And the first one was pass the parcel, which is basically, if you're familiar with the game, it's where one student starts the interaction and then they pass it on to the next student. That student continues and passes it on to the next student and so on down the line. It's like a chain. And the other type of interaction pattern that we used was confetti. This is the paper that people throw at weddings traditionally. And they called it confetti because you basically put a task out there and the answers come back randomly, like a sprinkling of confetti. So it's quite nice. So now let me show you some examples, and this is where we get on to the practical part. So first of all, with Pass the Parcel, this lends itself to drills. And here's a nice example of a drill. Again, this is an activity that I've done as a speaking task in class as well. It works equally well in class or in a WhatsApp group chat. So here is where you'll start to see screenshots. So these are instructions taken directly from the book. When it's in green, it's me because I've taken it off my phone. And you provide the students with a list of ways of agreeing with something when they hear it, from the strongest, the most emphatic, definitely, to the weakest, well, I suppose, I guess, etc. And then you give them 2 options to choose between. Okay, they have to say or indicate in the chat which one they prefer and use one of these exponents of agreement to reinforce it. And here's the example, here's the model. I write traveling by bus or traveling by train. And you write traveling by train, absolutely. And that's it, that's the end of the task. If you don't like traveling either by bus or by train, you can write neither, okay? So these are the kind of responses that my students came back with. And as you can see, the first student here, Carlos, he just followed the instructions, wrote traveling by train, used one of the exponents for sure. But what's nice about this activity is that students can experiment a little bit if they want to. They can go beyond the sort of basic instructions of the task. And this is what Oscar did underneath. I guess that it's better traveling by train because you have more places to sit in. Okay. Then once they'd all answered this and expressed their preference, this is the pass the parcel idea, then it's passed on down the line. So the next part of the instruction says, now it's your turn. Okay, so you answer the previous question, bus or train, and then you set your own this or that task. You can see the example underneath. Bus or train? Train, definitely. Cats or dogs? Cats for sure. Pasta or pizza? And so on down the line. And each time it's a different student answering and setting the next task. And I'm just going to show you some examples of the kind of this or that task that they came up with. And their examples were wine or beer, summer or winter, Harry Potter or Game of Thrones. You have to remember that we were in the summer of 2017. I think it was the middle of the final season of Game of Thrones, so everybody was talking about it. Apple or Android. That's just a sample of the kind of ideas that they came back with. And then they answered them and gave their opinions in certain cases. So that's an example of a pass the parcel style activity. So let's have a look at the more open activities like confetti interaction. And this lends itself to question and answer or guessing games particularly. Okay, this is one of my favorites, again, from Jill and Lindsay's book. There's some confetti, just because I felt like it. And this is an activity called My Angle On. And here are the instructions and the model. So in the instructions in WhatsApp, the WhatsApp group, I asked them to choose an object that has special meaning for them and to take a photo of it from an unusual angle. Not too difficult, but it was impossible to guess, but not too easy either, because we wanted them to have some difficulty guessing. Otherwise, it's not very interesting. So that was my example underneath. And when everybody had posted their photos, there was no writing at this point. Then I put the next part of the instructions. Now look at your classmates' pictures, choose 3 and ask 1 question for each of these 3 pictures to find out what the object is. This lends itself very nicely to practice of question structures. No, is it made of metal? Yes, it is. Do you use it in the kitchen? No, you don't, etc. Now, very importantly here, if 3 people have already asked a question about the object you chose, choose another picture. It's very important at the beginning, especially, to make sure that everybody gets questions and answers to respond to, because there's nothing worse than being left out of a WhatsApp chat. That's true in life, and it's true when you're learning a language as well. Okay, and there's the deadline that I've set for them to ask their questions. Okay, and this is me in green again, and this in the bottom half of this picture. If you haven't already guessed the mystery object, the owners should reveal what it is. And mine was a photo frame with a picture of my dad. Okay, the comment above, by the way, is from one of the students who's teasing the others because he's just won some extra points for his class, for his group. This was the competition I was telling you about before. And it's a nice example of him swapping between English and Spanish there. Now, to demonstrate this, I'm going to show you a picture that one of my students in this group put into the chat. And obviously, I'd like you to guess what the mystery object is. Okay, so are you ready? I'd like you to write into the chat, what is the mystery object in this photo? And I'm going to watch the chat and see what you come up with. Tiles, floor tiles. A pillow. Okay, right. Most of you are commenting on the tiles on the floor. And I'm very glad that you did that, because that's exactly what I thought as well. Some of you are saying a pillow. I don't see the pillow, but maybe it's because the pattern looks like a pillow. But most of you are looking at the floor tiles, right? But surprisingly, the answer to this, yes, it's got something to do with the shadow. Look at the shadow and the shape of the shadow, because one of the students guessed it correctly. The answer was a bike. Somebody's just said it. Okay, so when they guessed correctly, yes, Jose, you discovered me, it's my bike. And Jose responded, it's very difficult, but I am a cycling expert. He's joking. I'm like you, I can't see it. I said, this is a bit of a stupid question. The teacher very often gets a lot of mileage out of playing dumb. I can't see it. It looks like floor tiles to me. And Jose very helpfully tries to explain it to me. He even posts a picture with an arrow to show me what we're looking at. Bless him. That was very, very kind of him. You have to look at the shadow on the floor. You need to observe it closely to realize completely, etc. But you can see that this one photo generated an awful lot of interaction. And it also allowed these two boys to find that they had a shared passion for cycling, which is something that they hadn't discussed, even though they'd been in class together every day for 5 hours a day. Okay, so Giuseppe posts a picture of his bike, and for Jose particularly, and Jose responds, wow, I like your bike. And I respond, I like the floor, because I do. It is a beautiful floor, or even a pillow if you prefer. Okay, so that's an example of how one picture can generate more interaction. Now, the next group, group B, we thought it would be interesting if we tried to integrate the tasks more closely into what the students were actually doing in class. And to give you an example of this, this was a B1 group, and it was using English File Intermediate. Many of you will be familiar with this. It's a best-selling book in Spain. And they were working, in this example, they were working on Unit 9, quantifiers, okay, which often causes a lot of problems. And here's an example from the WhatsApp group for this group. Now, I wasn't part of this group, so I've had to borrow some of these pictures from the teachers and the MA student who was interacting with them in this case. And Matt, the teacher, posts this task here. And he says, hello, superstars. This last week, we're going to practice quantifiers. So he makes it quite explicit. Take a photo of what's in your fridge, and other people in the group will make suggestions about what you could make for dinner. Okay. And this is a photo posted by Jasmine. Jasmine is the MA student that was working together with Matt in the task. And Matt responds to her, and look how he highlights the target language. This is what we call input enhancement. Now, so the students know exactly what they're supposed to be using, what they're supposed to be practicing. So he says, wow, Jasmine, you don't have enough food for a big meal, but you've got a few eggs and lots of vegetables, so you could make an omelette. It's a good suggestion. Okay, and then he responds to Jasmine with his own pictures. Now, I hasten to add, that is not his fridge. I think he's taken that off the internet. The picture, I apologize for the picture quality here, because this isn't the original WhatsApp chat. It was taken off a PowerPoint slide presentation. So he posts his picture, and now the students respond to him. And as you can see, they respond saying, commenting on the huge amount of meat that he has. He has too much meat for a class of 20, but not enough for 30. And then it's interesting here that a lot of the typical problems with these quantifiers come up in the chat. As you can see, Spanish students often put a T at the end of enough in the spelling. They have problems spelling it. And then in the next chat, in student 3, he says, you have lots of meat and a few fish. So there's this lack of control of the difference between few and a few, or little, etc. So in this group, Matt then collected some of the errors and they went through them in class on the Saturday morning before they started the next class. So this was a fantastic way of keeping the focus going on the target language during the week and also recycling language from the previous week's class via WhatsApp and keeping it alive. And Matt is very funny as well, so that worked very well. Now, talking about feedback, the next group that we moved on to was Group C. And again, I was the teacher for this group and I was working with an MA student who was helping me in the WhatsApp class, so I didn't have to do so much work. And this was, again, integrated into the course. And this time we experimented with giving them feedback. This was on Zoom now because it was during the pandemic or during remote teaching, in the class and sometimes in the chat itself during the task, no more immediately. So the MA student in this case was called Bridget, and when she wanted to give them delayed feedback, she collected the errors the same way that Matt did, but instead of presenting them in class, she posted them in the WhatsApp group at the end of the week. So she'd make 4 or 5 pictures and then invite them to comment on the incorrect sentences and suggest corrections. Okay, so in this case, for example, you can't open these pictures, but you know what it's like. It functions in WhatsApp. You can open them as images. And then the second part of the course, when the last part of the intervention, she experimented with more immediate feedback. And this time we decided on using a little emoji, a little face like this, a thinking emoji, to indicate to the student that there was a problem. So you can see here that this student, Mario, says his face was used to advertise a famous alcoholic drinking made in Badalona. And Bridget has put a little thinking face there, thinking emoji, and he's corrected it successfully to drink. He's even used the asterisks, which is very common convention when you're correcting yourself in WhatsApp or a platform of this type. We noticed in this group, in Group C, that there was, apart from the task that we were doing, there was an awful lot of spontaneous interaction. The students weren't just using the WhatsApp group to talk about the task, they were using it for other reasons. Now, Bridget, the MA student in this case, is from the United States. She's from Boston, and our course coincided with the American elections. And so there was a lot of excitement when the results were coming through. Do you remember that long night where they were publishing the results very late and people were up all night watching them come in? So the students did the same thing. They were publishing the results of different states as they came in and commenting on it. And Bridget was joining in the conversation as well, very suspenseful. Nobody knew what was going to happen. Now, because there is so much spontaneous interaction and the students were kind of taking over the chat, for the most recent group, we decided to let them set their own tasks. So this is what we call learner-generated tasks or prompts. And in this case, the teachers, because there was the main class teacher and there was the MA student, also coincidentally called Jasmine, no relation to the first Jasmine, modeled the prompt. This is Jasmine posting a video of a famous cheese rolling competition in the United Kingdom where people roll a wheel of cheese down a hill and they follow it. There are lots of accidents. And she asked the students to comment on it and ask them what they think and tell her about local festivities in their own area. You can see some of their responses here. What do you think about this event? Wow, Jasmine, that's crazy. It looks so dangerous, but fun too. And afterwards, this student says, I'm a cheese lover, but I really appreciate my life. So I'm not going to sacrifice a limb or a neck in order to catch this huge cheese rolling down the hill. Okay, so she modeled this for a week or two. She had a couple of tasks in each week and got the students used to responding to it. And then she invited them to set their own tasks. Now, she gave them a calendar. So she said, Jordi, you're going to set the task on the 1st of April. And then Maria, you will do it on the 5th of April. So they knew exactly when they had to post their tasks. She gave them plenty of ideas for things to ask about or questions to write. She suggested viral videos, memes. One meme that was very popular when this group was in action was this one you might recognize. Okay, so she used this as one of her examples. What do you know about Bernie Sanders? Have you seen this meme? What do you think of it? It also links in nicely with current events. It's things that are happening at the moment. As you can see, this meme was very current at the time. In my previous group, they were talking about the American elections as it was happening. So it's very up to date. And it brings in students' lives and their own opinions, but only to the extent that they want to. They choose how much they want to share with the group. So she gave them ideas, and she also provided frames for them to set their questions. What's your favorite so-and-so and why? Have you seen such and such, and what did you think? What do you know about Bernie Sanders, for example? Okay, so this allowed the students to set their own tasks. So the learners then provided the prompts. Okay, so this is one of the students here saying, do you have any place where you want to go when all the restrictions end? Okay, so this is us studying from home, learning remotely. Everybody's obsessed with restrictions and vaccinations, etc. And then the other students respond. Now, in this case, both Jasmine, the MA student, and Danny, the teacher, tried very hard to get the students to leave oral responses using the voice recording function. They weren't very keen. I don't know about you, but in my group of friends, I have a couple of friends who always leave voice messages, but they're kind of in the minority still. And there's reasons for that. I think I'll come on to that when we come on to the results. Okay, so what results did we get? Okay, so these are the 4 groups again, A, B, C, D, over the 4 different years. And if you look at the totals, you might think that group B is a little bit disappointing because there weren't so many responses or there wasn't so much activity in this. But in many ways, group B is probably the most typical, the most representative group because it was a normal class. They had 1 class a week of 4 hours. There was no pandemic, so they had lives of their own and social lives. If you think about it, Group A was a summer intensive course, so they're very motivated anyway, and they're more immersed, as I said before. And Group C and Group D were done when we were learning remotely from home and teaching remotely from home. And in many cases, especially in Group C, some of the students were living on their own, and this was one form of interaction that they didn't have. So I think people were probably using the WhatsApp group for social interaction to a large extent. As you can see, I was alone in Group A, so I didn't really participate as much as in the other groups. In this case, it was mainly the MA student who was leading the chat, answering questions, responding to errors, etc. But on average, we probably had, over the 4 groups, we had about between 15 and 18 messages per day and somewhere around 20 messages per student over the course of the activity, which, considering this is completely voluntary, is not bad at all. And in terms of participation, the most successful tasks were the drills because it was very safe. Students could go beyond the demands of the task if they wanted to. They could exchange personal information. This is exploiting the natural information gap that we have between students. They're very curious about each other's. And anything involving images had a higher than average response rate, so they encouraged participation. The highest response rate of all was when the students set their own tasks. They really enjoyed that. But as yet, they're reluctant to leave speaking messages, to leave spoken messages. Maybe in the future, in the next WhatsApp group, we're going to experiment with preparing them a little bit in class so they feel a bit more secure. Okay, so in terms of group dynamics, one thing we noticed is that any students who joined the group late tended not to participate. I think as well, you'll agree in life, if you come into a group late, it's harder to feel a sense of belonging. The attrition effect with the first 3 groups, when the tasks had multiple parts, participation went down at each stage of the task. They lost interest or they got interested in the next task and they gave up. In terms of the type of contribution, it certainly increases the out-of-class use of English, which was our main objective. There were very few contributions in the first language, and the students seemed to take over the group. They really did take ownership of the group. It became theirs. You can see this very clearly with this map of interaction from the first group, my group, Group A. The blue bars represent the contributions related to a task, and the red bars, contributions outside the task. Okay, so you can see in the second part of the course that the red bars really took off. They just took over. This last peaks were them saying goodbye to each other, organizing the end of course meal, etc. They tend to use this off-task interaction to talk about administrative questions, things like what's the homework for tomorrow, but also social questions. They kind of tease each other, they laugh at each other, they play around with the language. Well, they say, this is level 4, I want to stay at level 4, and I want to go to level 5. And they showed their own personalities and identities in the group. They exhibited real life behavior. Their personalities came through. There was a lot of teasing and joking, as I said before. Here's an example. This is a picture of a student who fell asleep during the end of course meal. And so somebody posted, one of the rare instances that they posted in Spanish, soñando con el aprobado, which is dreaming about a pass. And he responded, Carlos, who's the student who fell asleep, with this kind of nonsense language. He certainly didn't feel any pressure that he had to respond in English, or they just used emojis when they wanted to. Okay, and somebody posted jokingly, what's the final task, WhatsApp task? What is Carlos dreaming about? And Oscar responds, about food, obviously. So in terms of student feedback, the students loved the WhatsApp task. It was a generally positive response. They prefer the immediate feedback. Yeah, there are some age differences. The older students may find it a little intrusive, so it has to be negotiated, and there needs to be clear ground rules. And what's rather lovely is that they carried on using the WhatsApp group even after the course finished. So you remember the two boys who discovered a mutual love of cycling? Well, this is them cycling around the hills outside Barcelona after the course had finished in August, with Jose's little dog, Princess, on the back of the bike, which is rather lovely. So based on these results, we would make some recommendations. I've just got a couple of minutes left. Start the WhatsApp group as soon as possible, because they're going to start a WhatsApp group anyway. So you might as well be in there and establish the language, the vehicle of communication as English, and to exploit it as much as possible. Give students a few days to get used to it. Tell them who to ask, either by giving them a list of names and telling them to ask the person underneath them in the list, or remember the instruction about if there are already 3 questions for this photo, choose another photo, to make sure that everybody gets maximum number of photos and questions and answers. Images as much as possible. There's no such thing as a stupid question. I think most teachers know that. I think you can see that even when I wasn't correcting the students, there was plenty of interaction, and I just participated really as another member of the group with the occasional stupid question, and they kind of responded to that quite well. Alternate drills for accuracy and more open activities for fluency, kind of like you would do in a class activity. One thing I learned to my cost is it's a good idea to pre-teach common expressions like ha 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 and wow, because they don't necessarily spell them or have the same expressions in their first language. So that's a useful one to teach. Vary your correction. Basically, try and save your own sanity a little bit here. You can negotiate this with students depending on how much time you have. You could do it only when they ask you. You could select recurrent errors. You could choose to correct them in the chat by using the thinking emoji, or you can collect some to correct in class at a later date. Really, just don't kill yourself in the WhatsApp group. We're busy people. Teachers don't often have the time to spend the amount of time correcting as we might want. Very often students will self-correct anyway. You can see in this little interaction here, they're teasing each other about the test. Oscar, I'm on fire for the test. It's tomorrow. And Josep says, test? It's a joke because the test was actually the same day. I have always want to say this sentence, and then he notices that he's made a mistake and says, I've always wanted. So given time, they probably will self-correct anyway. Tip 8, use emoticons for feedback. It's very efficient, very time efficient, and students react well to it. It's not intrusive. I think it's easy to get damaged with the emoticon. Sorry, I forgot the word. Get hurt, not get damaged. Tip 9, personal participation. If you're in the group as another member of the group, it encourages them to interact on the level of meaning rather than just thinking of it as tasks. So you're not just taking the classroom out of task. This is more a communication group. And in our experience, at least, and you might have different experience of this, the speaking tasks might need a little bit more practice. They might need a little bit of extra setting up before we go in. There have been a couple of publications based on these studies. One of them is hot off the press, actually. It's just come out this month in the ELT journal. That's the first one. And another one came out earlier this year looking at the earlier study, and that was published in Computer Assisted Language Learning. Okay, and I'm going to make these links available to Paul later, so I'll be able to publish them. Those are the references that I used during the talk. And it just remains for me to thank all of you for coming, and the teachers that were involved in the study, and the MA students who participated, the students who were involved in the study. And I'm going to thank you in the same way that my students would in the WhatsApp group, with a little emoticon. Okay, and those are my contact details. And I think, if I'm not wrong, we a bit over time, but we still have 10 minutes or so, Paul, for some question and answers.
We have. Right. There's quite a few questions, but I think a lot of them actually you've kind of covered.
Okay.
Yes, lots in there, lots of really interesting stuff in there. Really.
Right. Shall I stop sharing this now? I just wanted to give people a couple of minutes.
Yeah,
there you go.
Great. Yeah, no, really fascinating, actually. I think, I mean, I'm trying to formulate ideas in my head because there's so much there. I think, I mean, I think coming from the webinar earlier, if anyone was in that webinar earlier with Jay Gore, which was looking at sort of flow theory and kind of the random factor, a lot of that sort of echoed a little bit with some of the the idea of the task, you know, post a photo or something, you know, it's that idea of taking away I don't know, it's a threat or what it's an engaging task, you know, that sort of has nothing obviously to do with language learning as such, but it's obviously using the second language. So it's really interesting to sort of see it used, you know, or some of those ideas, I guess, that we saw earlier, sort of echoed a little bit into these, but using a very different format.
It's a different medium, but the idea behind it is the same. I think this is just WhatsApp is just so convenient for these students. But what could be more engaging for them as them setting their own tasks in a way? So just sort of literally wind them up and set them off. And get them going.
I love it. It's brilliant, and it's that, you know, we talk about learn autonomy. You know, this is that in action, very much. And it's fascinating to see the graph that you showed, where the blue and the red, and you can sort of see towards the end obviously the red goes up as they take control of it and it becomes their thing, but then they're using English as well.
Exactly.
That they're learning. So.
And this was a pattern that was repeated across all 4 groups, and that was for my group because I happen to have the data on it. But the other groups, the same thing happened. I mean, as you can see with the American elections, they just wanted to talk. I think during the confinement, during the lockdown as well, with the pandemic, this was just a great way for them to interact with each other. And if they were doing it in English, they didn't really seem to notice.
No. I mean, that was one of the questions. Was there a sort of a tendency? Did you notice at all sort of a slip into sort of L1?
The only time they used L1, Paul, seriously, was when there were expressions that they didn't know and they were asking for translation. Or sometimes, particularly in the activity about festivals and local festivities, when there were words that were very difficult to translate into English because there was no equivalent. But they tended to avoid it, really. Even in the social interaction, which wasn't on task, the main language of interaction was English. I think once you establish it, and that's why it's important to set up the WhatsApp group as quickly as possible, because they're going to have one anyway. And if you're not part of it, then you might risk there being a kind of classroom task WhatsApp group and general sort of interactive WhatsApp group where they might be using their own language. Whereas you can combine them both to maximize the amount of interaction they have in English. It depends on the level. I've only ever done this, the lowest level we've done this with is B1, but they're more than capable.
And it's using a medium that they use every single day in their lives as well. So there's no sort of, you know, technical whatever to. What I was interested in, I think, and it's sort of echoed in a couple of the questions and comments. Were you using like your personal mobile phone, or did you still have a separate, I would say burner phone, but like a sort of separate kind of?
In the first group, I actually had a mobile phone provided by the research group, but I've been in WhatsApp groups with my students for the last 5-6 years, I think. I'm in WhatsApp groups with them now, and I've never had any problems But obviously
Okay.
that is very context dependent. So you've got to be
Mhm.
careful. A lot of people in the chat are commenting on netiquette, establishing rules, and I completely agree.
Mm.
The teachers in this webinar are all experts on their local context, and they're going to know what works best and what doesn't work best. But
Sure.
you and I know that in Catalonia, WhatsApp is ubiquitous.
Mhm.
Okay, and if you're
Yeah.
not in the WhatsApp group, you miss out on a lot. So people generally, I'd say I've never had any problems with anything inappropriate or
Mhm.
any misuse of the WhatsApp
Yeah.
group, but that's the local context, obviously.
Yeah. And these were university students. Were they university
Yeah, not all
students?
of them.
Yeah.
They were studying at the language school of the university. So most of them, I think about
Okay.
60% of them generally are university students, and the other 40% are either adults working,
Mhm.
or we have a large proportion of senior learners as well who come to the university to keep active
Okay.
and
Okay.
keep their
Okay.
brains stimulated. So
Okay. That's
probably about
interesting.
20% of the learners are retired.
Right.
They were
Okay.
the ones
That's
that struggled perhaps with the WhatsApp group a little bit more. You know, it might be, if you
yeah.
have older learners like that, you might need to show them how to turn off the notifications and things like that, because it can
Sure.
be a little bit annoying.
Yeah, I was going to say that kind of intrusive sort of ding, ding, ding every time. And if
Yeah.
obviously it's a very active group, then it's, you know, sort of conversely, I suppose. Did you sort of find, and again, so I'm sort of asking these questions, but they are questions that have been kind of put in the chat.
Sure.
I'm not just sort of still haven't got my own agenda and I'm ignoring everyone else's questions. Sort of reluctance, but I mean, obviously you sort of set the WhatsApp group up as early as possible, presumably encouraging participation as well. Did you sort of find that there were students, like in life, really, in WhatsApp groups, people who said very little or did
Yes.
very little? Yeah.
And it was important that it was completely voluntary. Nobody was forced to participate.
Okay.
But what we found from the feedback, and I haven't really had time to go into this, that even the students that weren't participating were reading.
Right.
Okay, so
Right.
in some of the comments in the questionnaire and the open-ended questions in the questionnaire, they were saying they felt part of the group and they were learning from the mistakes of others and the corrections, but they didn't really want to participate. But they had the option to, but they just chose to be more lurking.
Okay.
You know, you get that occasionally, don't you? The lurkers who just want to be in the background, but they're reading and they're getting something from it. So even if you don't think they're participating, they might be by more passively, but they're actually getting the input.
Yeah.
They're learning something from it. So that was a nice response. Another student said the good thing about WhatsApp is that it comes to you. You don't have to go and find it. We did some very similar activities on Facebook. And again, there was a large participation. They went down very well. Students liked it, but they had to log into Facebook. They had to find the group. They had to go and look and see what was said. Whereas with WhatsApp, it's just there. You don't have to go and get it. No, it comes to you.
Yeah. No, okay. That's great.
So that's why we chose to continue with the WhatsApp rather than the Facebook or another platform.
Okay. Yeah, true. Okay, that's interesting. There is a question that I haven't asked from Dwayne around sort of the chat and the voice thing. So that it says many students can chat or write or type messages in English easily, but don't speak the same as they write.
Yeah.
There's the idea of the chat for immediate responses, so that you're sort of getting their initial thoughts, which might more closely reflect their speech, or not an immediate response, so sort of thinking in English and less worried about the speech sort of element.
Yeah.
Just sort of interested about the way the chat was used rather than video or voice recording.
Well, in the last project, in the last group, we definitely tried to encourage them to use the video recording or the voice recording option more. Some of the studies looking at WhatsApp have said that WhatsApp interactions are somewhere between written and spoken interaction, because they're not fully written. You know, they're not as formal. They're not full sentences. Somebody said at the beginning of the webinar, you know, it's not correct English. Now, in many cases, it's not. So in that respect, it's a less formal structure, less formal manner of interaction. But the fact that you record something and you can't go back and correct it in the same way as when you're writing, and then you're putting it out there for all your colleagues in your group to hear, I think a lot of our students found that quite exposing, now a little bit challenging. So it would need a little bit more scaffolding, I think, before we ask them to do that outside class. And the
Yeah.
point of this was to maximize the amount of time they spent engaged with English outside class. So doing it in class kind of defeats the object in a way. But it would be worth setting it up. That's probably what we're going to try out next.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's something that it sort of evolves as students become more confident, and it's also, I guess, a cultural thing, because in some, I was looking in the chat, in some cultures, sort of chat is incredibly common. In others, you know, voice or just text is. So I guess it just sort of depends, possibly on the.
As I said before, these teachers are the experts on their context. They're going to know which works better. You know your students.
Yes. Well, no, exactly. Brilliant. Lovely, really enjoyed that. That was great. really. I mean, just and a fascinating project, I think, as well, probably to kind of work on and to do.
There'll be some more.
Yeah. Good. I hope so. Right. Yeah. Sorry, I could talk forever, but we're going to have to stop. I'm just going to share my screen and just let people know what we've got coming up. Hopefully, you can see that on your screens. So tomorrow we've got Nikki Hockley, who's going to be talking about digital literacies based on the updated version of their book, Digital Literacies. Nikki and Gavin Dudney and Mark Pegram. There's a sort of second edition coming out soon, and so Nikki's going to be talking about sort of digital literacies, sort of a rebooted version, I guess, of that. So join us for that one. And it's all about literacy tomorrow. So we have digital literacies at midday UK time, and then at 5 p.m. UK, we've got Kerry Jones and Kath Billsworth, who are going to be talking about eco-literacy, what that is, why it's important, and how you can use it in your teaching, or how you can incorporate it into your teaching. So you can still register for both of those. Please do come along. It'd be lovely to, well, not I would say lovely to see you, but obviously we can't see you. It'd be lovely to see your chat, your comments. So thank you to you, obviously everyone in the chat and participating, and for your comments. And also a big shout out and thank you to Marcus and to Karen monitoring the Facebook side of things. To everyone watching on Facebook, I hope that's been engaging for you as well as it has for us. And that's sort of pretty much it for today, other than just to say thank you again. Huge thank you to you, Jessica, for giving up your time. Like we said, you're busy, I know, so I really appreciate it. And again, fascinating, really great. Thanks very much, everyone. And thanks, Jessica.
It's been a pleasure.
Brilliant. Good. I'm pleased.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all. Hopefully see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.